Now we go into a very crucial discussion in Christology, and I hope that this will clarify many of the deep questions that many of us ask from time to time. And I hope this will clarify also the confusion we make about the life of Jesus Christ before his death and resurrection. We shall call this lesson here in this video now the lesson about looking back into the life of Jesus Christ. A word that can help us here is the word retrospect. Retrospect. To retrospect means to look back, and to look back in terms of Christology is to look back into the life of Jesus. To look back into what we have been calling before as the pre-Easter or before Easter about Jesus. The apostles, after the resurrection, looked back into the life of Jesus. They recalled the life of Jesus. They recall the times that they were together with Jesus. They recall the different experiences they had with Jesus, experiences they had about Jesus. They look back and then they say, we now understand what he has been saying and doing. The apostles affirmed this because of the resurrection. So notice that the looking back or the retrospect is done in the light of the resurrection. Do not forget retrospect. Retrospect.
Retrospect. Retrospect. Retrospect.
Let us not forget that the point of origin in looking back is the resurrection. The apostles and the Christians at that time looked back at the life of Jesus, beginning with the resurrection. Now, let us not forget that this person who rose from the dead, this resurrected person, is none other than the same Jesus of Nazareth. The same Jesus of Nazareth who was encountered by the apostles, encountered by many people. This is the same Jesus who lived in Nazareth, who lived in Palestine. This is the same Jesus who was crucified and who died. So the resurrected Jesus is the very same Jesus who lived and died. This is why the remembrance of Jesus while he was still in Palestine was not separated from Jesus risen from the dead. To look at the life of Jesus is to look at it in the light of the resurrection. Now let us not also forget that the gospel authors, including the other authors of the New Testament, look back into the life of Jesus. The gospel authors wrote their gospel texts in retrospect. The gospel authors were gathering information from the oral tradition, and then they put that into writing. But all of that is in retrospect. The oral tradition and the writing itself were already retrospect, marked by the experience of the resurrection, marked by the belief that Jesus rose from the dead. If we look, for example, at Mark, notice how Mark wrote about Jesus. Mark wrote about Jesus as a kind of secret Messiah, the secret Christ. He wrote about Jesus as a weak and humble Son of God. Notice that it is already from the point of view of the resurrection. Notice the first verse in the Gospel of Mark. There we read, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. When Mark wrote Jesus, Son of God, he was not writing that from the point of view of the before Easter experience. He was writing that from the point of view of the after Easter experience, the resurrection. So it is a retrospect. So Mark wrote his gospel and said that this man Jesus was Son of God. That was not the idea about Jesus Christ before Easter. That again is a looking back of Mark into the life of Jesus. Now, if we continue with Mark, what do we see? We see also the story of the Transfiguration in chapter 9. Now, the Transfiguration is presented as an anticipation of the glory of the resurrected Jesus Christ. It is written as an anticipation of the glory of the risen Christ. Now that story of the Transfiguration can only be written because the resurrection was already confirmed, because Jesus has already risen. And so when Mark wrote about the Transfiguration, he was writing that in retrospect. Mark already believed in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and then he wrote about the Transfiguration. And when he wrote about the Transfiguration, he was presenting a Jesus Christ glorified. So Mark was saying that even in the earthly life of Jesus, there was already the glorification of Jesus. Saint Mark was doing a retrospect of the glory of Jesus in the resurrection, and he is using that retrospect to say that even in the life, the earthly life of Jesus, there was already glory. So Mark was already glorifying Jesus even before Easter.
I hope you understand.
Now, try reading the gospel stories, especially the synoptic gospel stories, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and notice how many elements inside those stories are really results of retrospect, results of looking back with the influence of the belief that Jesus is risen from the dead, Jesus is resurrected, that Jesus is glorified, exalted as Lord and Christ. The exalted Lord and Christ is inserted into the retrospect writing of the Gospels. Notice that many parts of the Gospel stories are really retrospect stories, ways of looking back from the point of view of the resurrection. Try it out. Read the Gospels. Read the Synoptic Gospels. Let me stimulate you. Read, for example, the parable of the homicide of the beloved Son in Mark chapter 12. See if you can discern the retrospect involved in the writing of that parable. The retrospect of Mark inserted something, a point of view that can only be taken from the belief in the resurrection of Jesus. Try it out. To appreciate and understand the life of Jesus, it must be seen in the light of the Lord resurrected and glorified. Christ, who is the glorified person, cannot be separated from the Jesus, the human, earthly man who lived in Nazareth and in Palestine. There is no separation between Christ and Jesus. The title Christ is a title that was given after Easter. It was a title given in the light of the resurrection. But that title was given in retrospect to the life of Jesus. It was projected in retrospect to the life of Jesus. Now we can add and say that one of the major reasons why the Gospel authors retrospected into the life of Jesus is to show that there is really no distinction and no separation between the Jesus of Nazareth and the glorified Christ. The Gospel authors were trying to emphasize that this man who rose from the dead, glorified, exalted at the right hand of God, and is now Lord and Christ, this man is the very same Jesus of Nazareth. So I hope we understand the motivation for that retrospect. The Gospel authors looked back into the life of Jesus, and there they had to see the Christ present already in that life. The Jesus of Nazareth was already the Christ, but the realization of that came only after the resurrection. This is very crucial. Now, this may sound very academic and classroom thinking, but really, if you look closely at the way we struggle with our faith, we can see that many of our difficulties lie in this confusion between the Jesus of Nazareth and the Christ elevated and Savior. Or to put it in very simple terms, many of our confusion about Jesus Christ is about how human He is and how divine He is. The New Testament is teaching us something here about Jesus Christ, to conserve the whole unity of Jesus Christ. And therefore, the risen Lord who is glorified Son of God is the same as the Jesus who lived in Nazareth. If you find this video very abstract, feel free to repeat it over and over again